This is Pete Rollins, and this episode of Homebrewed Christianity is brought to you by Theology Beer Camp. This is an event where you'll see me humiliate Trip Fuller, where you'll see me make him cry and pray to his God for salvation. Is that what you wanted?
Well,
Trip?
I mean, you can't sponsor your own podcast, but if you live in Denver or you live in Oklahoma City,
Yeah.
or anywhere near it this August.
And they're in America, yeah?
Yes, they are.
They're the two American places.
Two American places.
Yeah.
We're going to have Theology Beer Camp in August, and people should clearly come
Oh, yeah.
because, you only live once.
It was supposed to be called Theology Gin Camp, but I was overruled.
You were overruled.
That's going to be the next one.
Well, everyone has things on their wish list, but go to theologybeercamp.com and come hang out with us this summer. And maybe I'll cry, but it'll probably be because if y'all have never seen Pete at karaoke, then
we have something in common because I have never seen me do karaoke either.
Really?
Yep.
It was hard to watch yourself. Don't worry, we'll videotape it. Well, Theology Nerds. This is Trip. And guess what? This is a special episode because on occasion, friends of the podcast occupy the feed.
Just take it over.
I know currently I am doing LectioCast.
This is such a weird thing happening right now, right? Like, Daniel is not doing the LectioCast. You're doing the LectioCast.
Yeah.
You're not doing the TNT.
Today.
Daniel's doing the TNT. Like, what is going on?
Daniel.
The first will be last. I don't
Daniel
understand
Kirk.
what's happening here.
Daniel Kirk, he just wanted to get more downloads. Daniel Kirk is going to be talking to Jeffrey Pugh. So Daniel wrote a book about Jesus recently. Pugh wrote a book in the Homebrewed Guide series to the end. And I said, Daniel, you like the Bible. This book is about eschatology and apocalypticism in the Bible. And y'all should talk to each other because I really feel like it's a emerging friendship. And when you listen to it, you'll say, that was good. I like that. And if for some reason you don't have Daniel's new book or Jeff's, you should go get it. Because, look, if you already have Jeff's, the Homebrewed Christianity Guide to the End, there's no reason you shouldn't prepare for the eschaton by buying multiple copies.
Or pre-ordering the rest of the series.
Yeah. The Homebrewed Christianity Guide to Church History is coming soon. Mm-hmm. The proofs, everything. I've seen it. It's going to be headed your way soon. Soon
and very soon.
Oh, yeah. You're going to see the Lord. And Origen wrote a blurb for the back of the church history book.
I knew it.
Everyone's favorite early church father.
Perfect.
Writing reviews. And I don't know if Origen's reviewed anyone's book recently. Well, outside of the Heavenly Theology Journal. I'm sure Jesus is he lets them all.
I mean, this is an exclusive.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a get right here.
Yeah. Origen reviewed the book. I'm not even going to tell you what it said. You have to go on the internet and find it.
Yeah.
I don't want to ruin it.
Yeah.
It's best to see it right there in print.
Which, I mean, that just goes to show you, the level of content that we're bringing you.
I know. For the Homebrewed Guide series, we try to get endorsers you haven't heard from, like
in thousands of years.
Jeff's book, On the End, the second Horseman of the Apocalypse reviewed the book.
Yeah.
Who does that?
That's a Homebrewed exclusive.
I know. The Guide to God, Vishnu had thoughts.
Yeah.
Now, church history Origen. He's got something.
This is great. See, you don't get this anywhere else.
No. I'm going to guess that most publishers,
they don't even think to reach out to these people. You know what I mean?
They don't. Yeah, they don't. They're like, have we thought about famous dead people or deities from other religions? Like, is that an option? They don't think about that. And I'm like, whatever. I got Origen's cell phone number. It's area code 777.
Perfect.
Oh, yeah. Well.
Which is clearly why you should support Homebrewed Christianity by becoming a community member.
Exactly.
That's how,
How else are you going to get access to Origin's cell phone number?
Exactly. So just go to homebrewcommunity.com and become a member.
Because you get, well, not only a part of the community and keep the podcast alive, and have cute children. You can help pay for their health insurance. But the other part is we have a new high gravity class coming up. It's about the Bible, and we're going to talk about different ways to read the Bible and how a Theology Nerd reads the Bible. People in the member group have asked for some high gravities that are more introductory in nature. So
this is a good on-ramp if you've been meaning to join, then this is the perfect opportunity to do so.
So just go to homebrewedcommunity.com. And remember, we're at Theology Beer Camp this summer, and we're going to be at Wild Goose Festival in July in the state of North Kakalak. And if you're coming and you want to camp with us, and our friends from Brew Theology are going to be there, Christian's going to be there, Culture Casting, Mickey's going to be there, Kristen Howerton's coming. Like, we're going to have fun. You should holler at us so we save space when we get there early, so we all camp near each other. Mm-hmm. If you want to be within camping distance of my snoring.
Which...
Why not?
Why not?
It's like the crickets, but in a different. It's like we're different pitches.
It's like a white noise machine, but just the noise part.
But I have a nice consistent snore. It's not so much one of those. When is it starting and stopping, and did he die?
Yeah.
It's just like a slow grumble. It's like a choo-choo train.
Yeah, it is.
And
you can experience that at Wild Goose with us.
You are welcome, friends, for that opportunity.
Because, when you stay up late hanging out, and then you need to get up early to go, see all the cool things.
And the sun comes up.
The snoring helps to wake you up. It keeps you up all night so that you don't really get any sleep.
Yeah.
So that it's not...
If you sleep just a little bit, you'll notice how tired you are.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's really beneficial.
Yeah.
I think.
Excellent. So, just trying to help you out. Alrighty.
Kirk and Pugh.
Here it happens right now in your earpiece.
All right, so we are going to dive into this discussion about your book, The End Times, Theology After You've Been Left Behind. This, of course, is part of the Homebrewed Christianity Guides to everything, I guess. This is the guide to the end times. It is a series that's meant to fit in your back pocket and read when you're on the subway. It's got funny things in it, and I want to find out soon how many of those you wrote, how many of them Tripp wrote, and we're gonna work that out. But before we get into the book itself, you have a personal history with Christian tales of the end and these apocalyptic eschatological movements in North America, and I'd love to hear you say a little bit about that, tell that story to give folks a little bit of a sense of where you're coming from as you tackle this issue.
Well, let me start with the sort of story of how I came to be in the series. Tripp and Tony Jones at a AAR SBL meeting accosted me at the Fortress Press reception.
Yeah, what they do is they stand back and they count your drinks, and after they think you're ready, then they come up to you with a pen and paper in hand.
I think that's what happens. And so they're like, "Dude, can you talk to us for a minute?" And they said, "Would you be willing to contribute a volume to the series?" And I said, "Sure, I'd be happy to." And because we'll say anything in some states, and so I started saying, "So what's available?" And I said, I said, "Is Jesus available?" And they said, "Tripp has that one." I went, "Yeah, okay." And then they started going down the list, church, Holy Spirit, and then they said end times. And I said, "That's the one I want," because that's the one I'd had the experience with. So basically, as you alluded to, I start out the book by talking about the fact that when I was a sophomore in college, I had a conversionary moment. Probably at the time I would have referred to it as born again. And this was way, way back in the day when there were Jesus freaks and not the group or not the DC Talk thing.
Talk, yeah.
And so this was back in the early 1970s, and I didn't know what to do with this newfound faith. And so a couple of weeks after I had had this moment, I read a story in the New York Times about a group called the Children of God. Well, it turns out that they had one of those communes 10 miles from my college. So a bunch of us got in a car and we drove up to them. And
New York Times leading people astray.
I mean, well, now I'm going to say that later on the New York Times also had a story about something called the Love-In Community, LoveinN, up in upstate New York outside of Ithaca, which was one of the first Jesus communes. And that group helped pull me back together after this other experience. So, New York Times is, good and bad. But anyway, so we went up there and, you're 19 years old. You don't know anything. You have no idea what's going on. And these people know everything. They have an answer to every question. They know the Bible backwards and forwards. And, I was raised Methodist. I didn't know anything about the Bible. So we ended up, a bunch of my friends ended up actually joining them and dropping out of college. It was spring semester of 1972, and I wasn't quite ready to make that move. So I went off to the Love-In Community instead and spent 3 weeks with them. I guess this community was most famous for where Phil Keaggy went to record Love Broke Through and his first Christian albums after Glass Harp. And so they sort of gave me a sense that there were other options out there. But I left them and came back to Virginia and joined the Children of God and was ended up with them for 4 months. And this is an apocalyptic group. I want to say cult, but cult is a very pejorative term. They were dissenting or a new religious movement, and they were definitely out of their minds. Which after 4 months, I sort of just looked around one day and I said, these people are batshit crazy. And I just have to get out. And that's a story in itself that I don't think we need to go into, but eventually I was able to find my way out of that community. But the kind of indoctrination or the ideas that they instilled within me kind of stuck around for a while. And my earliest communities were Pentecostal. Now, let me back up and say that right after this conversionary moment, somebody put a copy of The Late Great Planet Earth in my hand by Al Lindsay. And once again, you're 19, you don't know anything. This is the first time you've been exposed to this stuff, and you're reading this, and it's like, holy crap, I have the secret to the end of the world. How come nobody knows this? And you're sort of, it's a heady experience, right, to know things that nobody else knows, and you get a little prideful and your hubris starts to kick in, and you're going around grabbing people and talking about the fourth blood moon and,
right.
And,
you see what's happening right now is like, as a New Testament professor, and Jeffrey's done theology, that prideful need to tell everybody how to read the Bible rightly, it never goes away. It just gets redirected into more socially acceptable forms.
Yeah, it's true. So anyway, so that was my first exposure to this. And for, a good long time, I had no other options. I did not understand there were other options. So I sort of, just bought right into it. It wasn't actually until I went back to college and seminary that I started sort of understanding these texts in different ways than I had understood them before. So that's why I wanted to do the volume on the end times, because I understood that world in some very profound ways, because it was a part of my past.
Something that you experienced there, something that you talk about in terms of the whole dispensationalist system of how the end works, is that there is a self-perpetuating coherence to the narrative that gets told, that is not only this little piece of what you believe, but also the authority of the people who are telling you about it, and the answers that they have for when people tell you you're wrong. Could you talk a little bit about that, the significance of that kind of not just a coherent idea, but a whole coherent system of thought that perpetuates a system of belief? Because I think it has importance not only for this particular issue of dispensationalism and whatever, but a lot of the alternative constructions of reality that are deeply influencing American life right now in 2017.
Yeah, that's sort of an interesting linkage, but you could sort of see it playing out. So in my particular experience, what happens is that you are given, socialized, instructed into a particular grid of interpretation. And that grid of interpretation is laid on the text in such a way that you end up reading the text on the basis of that interpretive grid that has been drilled in you, to the point where you don't see other options for understanding the text.
Right.
And so what happens then is that there's a unitary sort of interpretation that comes out. This is what happens a lot of times for inerrancy folks, is they accept the notion not only of the biblical inerrancy, but of one singular interpretive grid for how their inerrant texts get interpreted. So the interpretation itself then acquires a kind of authority. And so this is exactly, say, for instance, what happens when the appearance of the Scofield Reference Bible shows up. The Scofield Reference, and we can talk about this and unpack this later on, but the Scofield Reference Bible becomes such an interpretive grid that I knew people that believed that the notes of Scofield's Bible were as inspired as the text of the biblical text. And so that kind of locks you in to a singular way of understanding or interpretation. And often that's solidified by a particular projective impulse that we have to sort of project our own biases, our own internal sort of structure, fears, hopes, dreams, whatever, onto certain texts. And so they become reinforcing, right? If you're thinking in a certain way and there's certain things you think about change or certain things you think about ambiguity, if you're fearful of those things, if those things make you uncomfortable, then you'll find yourself sort of becoming involved in a loop that doesn't allow other interpretations, other sort of text to come out. Now, if we're talking about contemporary society, those loops affect people all along a political spectrum.
Yeah.
But they can also affect people all along a theological perspective too. And I've seen it all along a theological perspective.
Yeah.
So.
One of the impacts of that sort of holistic way of thinking and the fact that we do have these grids, sometimes we'll be talking with somebody and we'll want to address an issue and it feels like they're always changing the point, right? Like they're always changing what we're talking about. It's like, oh, I thought we were talking about Daniel. Now we're talking about Revelation. Now we're talking about Matthew 25. Like, why can't you settle down? And part of it is that in our minds, when we are caught in these loops, or starting to pull the grid, it is all the same thing. So often for the person, it feels like the person is trying to change the subject, but for them, it's all this same thing. Okay, so your book is this Guide to the End Times. If you're going to talk about end times, in Christian theological parlance, this is eschatology. People often also bandy about the word apocalyptic, and we've got these post-apocalyptic movie genres, and I think that's my daughter's in middle school. I think every book she likes is some sort of post-apocalyptic.
Yeah.
What's the difference between apocalyptic and eschatology?
Well, I mean, I'm talking to a New Testament scholar here, but
And I'm going to grade your answer, actually.
Okay.
That's
that's exactly what I was worried about. Sort of, if we think about apocalypse as being the sort of uncovering or revealing, it was never meant to sort of indicate a cataclysmic end of the world, but the Greek word itself means to reveal or to uncover. And sort of that notion is far different than when we think about the sort of cataclysmic end of the world, but we have misused that word, I think, when we talk about apocalypticism or apocalyptic, or maybe not that we've misused it, but that we've taken the word then and we've filled it with other content that it did not originally have. So essentially, when we read the Apocalypse of John, when we read Revelation, what we see there is an unveiling or an uncovering. And when we read any apocalyptic literature, it's pulling back the curtain in a certain way. The author is sort of making an argument that no matter what we see happening around us on the planet, there are other realities at work, that if we could just look behind the screen, we would see that ultimately the spiritual reality of God is at work somewhere. So that's sort of apocalypticism, and then eschaton sort of is a notion more of the end, not in terms of telos or the goal, but just sort of, reflection upon the end of things, right? I mean, I'm going to leave that one there, and we can fill that in later.
Yeah. I think getting our heads around apocalyptic is important. I mean, obviously it's critical for reading Daniel and Revelation well. I think it's helpful for recognizing that it's also on a continuum with other kinds of literature, and biblical historical literature is often making a lot of the same assumptions. Like the story in 1 Samuel about the people taking the ark into battle, and then the ark gets captured and they put it in the temple of Dagon. And when the people wake up the next morning, Dagon is face down, basically bowing down before the ark, right? So I think what is the geopolitical theology that's going on there? It's, well, when we go into battle with our enemies, our gods are battling against each other, right? There is a battle in the heavens that's playing out here. And so when the Philistines beat up Israel, that means Dagon beat up Yahweh. So we're going to put Yahweh's box inside Dagon's temple so he can be there to render to Dagon the honor that Dagon is due. But then when they wake up the next morning, oh, no, you find out that actually Yahweh's more powerful, and Dagon's bowing down to Yahweh because Yahweh's greater. And this really just has to do with Yahweh disciplining God's people. It has nothing to do with, whether, who's got the bigger God, right? So, I mean, that is a narrative. It's like, that is a very thinly veiled, his quote unquote historical narrative that is depicting the way that the spiritual world is running parallel to the physical world that we can see. And so that thin veil is pulled back in Daniel, where it's like, well, there are these four beasts. Oh, and those are four kingdoms. And then this fourth beast has these horns. And then, oh, that's the bad king you're afraid of. And then, it's a way of saying God is involved in all of this geopolitical stuff, and God is looking out for God's people who right now are oppressed, because apocalyptic is almost always this literature from underneath, and
yes.
he's going to make sure that in the end his people are taken care of and the bad guys get justice.
Yeah, I mean, this is especially true if you think about the fact that apocalyptic literature is generated in three of the most serious political situations that Israel faces: Babylonian captivity, Maccabean revolt, and Antiochus, and 70 CE. If you think about that, the fact that apocalyptic literature gets generated out of those three moments. And look, here's the thing, and one of the most interesting things for Christians that would, I think, be really revelatory is to go read other apocalypses that are not necessarily in canonical text. So, just go read the Book of Watchers or the Book of Similitudes or Enoch, or, I mean, there and you see that kind of language, and that language is reflecting exactly what you just said. It's a kind of horizon of hope,
right?
Political hope for those people who are suffering under what seems to be unbearable oppression, and it indicates that, take hope that even in the midst of the circumstances in which you find yourself, the kings of the world ultimately don't have the ultimate power here. God does. Mm-hmm. And so if you can just hang on, then you'll be okay. And so apocalypses are in a certain sense written as horizons of hope, I think, mm-hmm. In a certain way.
Yeah. So let's think about this a little bit more. One of the watchwords for dispensationalist interpretation of Scripture is literal, whenever possible. What's the difference between literal and not literal interpretations, and how do you know which one to use when? And I just want to say, maybe this is my biblical scholar hobby horse. I don't find it helpful to say, like when folks say, I don't read the Bible literally, because I think there's a lot of the Bible we are supposed to read literally, even if, and then there's a lot of parts that are not meant to be taken literally. How do we know what to do when? Is there a responsible way to step back and make those judgments to honor the text and not to end up in the loony bin?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think one of the things that we do is we pay attention to the genre of the text itself. Mm-hmm. So that if the genre of the text is, say, for instance, apocalyptic, there's no way you can see Revelation as not being apocalyptic text. So then the writer of that text puts the reader on alert immediately that we're talking about the world of metaphor. Mm-hmm. Revelation as metaphor has gone wild in a certain sense.
Right.
So, I'm not sure that I would say when we look at the text of Revelation, we might take a passage of praise and we might talk about the literalness of our praise or our response to God. But when we're talking about, winged things and lamb and beast and dragons and, there's a certain way in which we're signaled that we do not have to take those things literally. Now that's different, say, for instance, in reading Acts of the Apostles or First Chronicles or, right. Those are sort of different ways of understanding the text. But I will say this, we've talked about this earlier. I'm not sure that there is ever one particular meaning. And maybe this was the glory of the medieval sort of way of understanding the text. I'm not sure there's ever any one particular meaning of a text that we get from it. We all bring to these texts our assumptions, our presuppositions, our life experiences. And I have to say that over my life, the meaning of text have changed significantly due to my life experience. I don't read the text the same way I did when I was 19. But I think just attention to genre for all of us would help guide us into a more nuanced reading of the way that these texts function.
Well, let's dig into that a little bit, and specifically with Daniel. You talk about Daniel a fair bit. Daniel has some visions of beasts and wars and victories and these sorts of things. One of the things that I was a little bit resistant to, or maybe where I wanted to see more in the book, was some of the specific ways that Daniel really, in my judgment, is fairly firmly nailed down to the 170s and 160s BC. And you seemed a little bit reticent to name the beast with what empires they were, or which king was being addressed, or maybe how that situation would resolve. When you're talking a second ago about not being sure there's ever one interpretation, and there's a sense in which I agree with that. But I guess I felt that from my reading of Daniel, I think that there is a place to stick it, very specific, where you can just about nail the year, based on where accounts of history shift into hopes for the future. So I'm curious, did you lay off on some of the specifics with Daniel because you're not sure that it should be read that specifically? Were you doing it just to open up the fact that this is amenable to the multiple interpretations, or because, it is just something that's caught in the reader response of whoever happens to be reading it at a different point in time?
Yeah, that's good. I guess I had thought that had indicated more closely that it was written during the Maccabean revolt, and specifically oriented to addressing the situation with Antiochus Epiphanes.
Yep.
That the first part of Daniel was not oriented to that, but that the second part, the largely apocalyptic literature, the apocalyptic sort of visions and stuff, were representative of the particular struggle with him, the abomination of desolation, the specific things that were sort of put into the text to indicate. And I think you're right. I mean, I think that can be fixed. And I think that, another fixing is that you could look at, it interprets itself in some ways, right? This is Assyria, this is Babylon, so there's a way in which it interprets itself and is kind of self-explanatory. What I was trying to shy away from maybe was the fact that dispensationalism comes at Daniel with a certain interpretive grid that only allows one particular rendering of that grid. Yeah. And that rendering that the dispensationalists give is that there is a kind of mystical element to this book, that these numbers have deeper significance for the future, and not for giving people hope that their oppression is limited to 42 months, 3.5 years, 1,260 days, blah, 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 blah. Right. That's great. That particular way of taking that text, I think, the dispensationalist way I'm talking about now, does I think violence to the original intent of the text to address the Greek oppression of Jews during the reign of Antiochus. Yeah. And I thought I hope that made that clearer than I might have.
Yeah, but you probably did. I may have just wanted to see it again and again and again. And, this is part of the trick of talking with dispensationalists about what these texts mean. As we mentioned a few minutes ago, things, they've got a whole interpretive grid. And so on the one hand, you can sit down and show how everything in Daniel is about, comes to its anticipated culmination in the 160s, except for two problems. One is the world doesn't resolve the way that Daniel anticipates the world resolving. It gives a picture of the end, especially in chapter 12, that doesn't, or even in chapter 7, of this worldwide reign of the Son of Man, i.e. Israel, that doesn't materialize then. So, it's a text waiting for an ending. And then when you get Jesus picking up and saying, when you see the desolating sacrilege standing where it shouldn't stand, then oh, look, see what Daniel was talking about is actually the exact same thing Jesus is talking about, where there's not the realization. So this is the second problem, is that there's not the realization that there are multiple meanings for the text depending on whether it's the original context in Daniel or whether that prophecy is being reappropriated in the Synoptic Gospels or whether it's being reappropriated in the book of Revelation. Those are talking about two different things as well. So it kind of, this is with that, that inerrancy, bringing with it the expectation of a singular, coherent meaning, it becomes very powerful when you can jam all this stuff together, and it becomes very difficult to have a conversation with somebody where you can pull it apart and say, no, look, Revelation is talking about Rome being the buttheads, and Daniel is talking about Greece being the buttheads, and Jesus is probably talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So pulling those threads apart is, I think it's at the heart of what's needed, but it's really hard to break into that system to do it.
Well, I mean, it is hard because of what you've just mentioned, is that the text itself can lend itself to that use, right?
Right.
But once again, if you read the apocalyptic texts that are being generated around Jesus's time, I'm assuming that those texts are not unknown to Jesus. So there's a kind of an issue of whether or not we're ever really totally finished with the apocalypse, or with apocalyptic thinking, and we're not. Obviously, we're here. We'll never be finished with the text of Revelation. But that's interesting because what you've just said, the sort of maybe legitimate way in which you could see the continuity between these texts, also reveals that the dispensationalists abuse these texts to create the fulfillment of them in their own time. Hal Lindsey, when he writes The Late Great Planet Earth, he talks about the fig tree, the parable in Matthew, about the fig tree. My God, how do you get from that fig tree the creation of the nation of Israel in 1948? I mean, but he does that. And then he says in his book, not one generation shall pass before all these things will be fulfilled. And he's been wrong about everything he's ever done. He makes this sort of leap to the biblical generation being 40 years and says Jesus will come back before 1988. Well, then he has to change it once 1988 comes around, So, I mean, so there is that sort of notion of continuity, but I'm just going to go ahead and say that it's a continuity of the unveiling of what's really going on. And still the horizon of hope that we never lose in the midst of human suffering. Now you could make the argument, well, that's just all bullshit. I mean, it's just all stuff that Christians wrote to make themselves, or Jews and Christians wrote to comfort themselves. And I think that's a legitimate critique. At the same time, I think that the vision that these offer gives us a kind of penetrating way into looking at the world. You cannot read Revelation 18 and not think about capitalism. I mean, the destruction of all the economic orders in the world, and that distinct place in Revelation 18, I think 18, where it says that they grieved, they wept because they could not buy and sell goods and human lives. The talking of the selling of human lives, the buy and selling of human lives, that transcends the ages, for me at least. That maybe there's a critique in here about the way that we're ordering the world, that we continue to order the world.
When I was in seminary, the Revelation instruction we got was a little bit kooky, but I think one of the better things was the way that the professor had us look at it and just see in different characters the critique of the merchants and the critique of sexuality. I think maybe he was over literalizing some of the sexual imagery, but it's worth. I think it's worth listening to the book of Revelation for a critique of the ways that those things grab the people's affections and drive our lives.
Well, the way that political orders operate in the book, I mean, when you think about, let's just take something, for instance, like the mark of the beast, right? which, I mean, that's an image that's driven so many things. And even in our day, in popular literature and movies and the books you were telling me your daughter reads and stuff, the Antichrist, I've seen that word, evoked a lot lately, in the contemporary context. But if we think about the Antichrist as a kind of a typology of the way that political orders operate to aggrandize to themselves absolute power. And then the number of the beast, that's the thing that, I have friends that I used to have, probably don't have them anymore, that used to freak out if they would get a receipt with $6.66 on it, and anytime they saw 666, they would just freak out. And I'm like, dude, it's symbolic. I mean, it's not a literal thing, but people see the literalness, and then what escapes them is the fact that this is a critique of an economic order.
Right.
That later on in that text falls. So I'm assuming that all of your listeners know what dispensationalism is before we go much further.
Why don't you give the 10-cent definition?
The 10-cent definition is that dispensationalism was a theological construct developed by John Nelson Darby and of the Plymouth Brethren in the 19th century. And he took this particular grid that he created and put it onto biblical text, biblical prophecy, to sort of straitjacket that thing into the dispensations, the different time periods where God was at work. And this is where we get all of the sort of tribulation, rapture, 7 year, 3.5 year, where he takes these texts that mention these numbers and these ideas, and then he creates a kind of understanding of the Bible that captured the imagination of the emerging evangelical / fundamentalist church in America in the 19th and 20th centuries. Dispensationalism and fundamentalism and some parts of evangelicalism, they formed a happy alliance, and because they were a lot about the same thing, and that did in deep ways structure the American mind, especially in fundamentalist and evangelical circles. So you'll see that institutions, books, industries, and stuff, the Left Behind industry, the Left Behind industrial complex, and would that I could write one book that would sell that. But these are things that sort of have an ongoing purchase in the imagination of the American evangelical / fundamentalist, and not all evangelicals, right? I mean, I'm talking about a certain segment of the evangelical community.
Right. But the idea that you could be an evangelical Christian in, say, the UK and never have heard of the rapture. Get your mind around that. This is an American creation, this particular theology. And I think that's, for my friends who have just been American Christians in more or less conservative, evangelical / fundamentalist worlds, I think it's really mind-blowing how much of our pop theology is not held anywhere else. Yeah, not shared anywhere else.
Right. That said, American evangelical missionaries did take it to all parts of the world.
Fair enough. So let's talk a little bit more in a little bit more depth about how apocalyptic texts work, and maybe in Revelation in particular. The story of the woman and the dragon is a great example of how apocalyptic texts work. So I'm wondering if you could maybe summarize that story for us and situate it in a Roman context, or how you think about that kind of story in a way that shows this is what apocalyptic does.
Well, that's an interesting story in the book itself, and I'm going to sort of refer to it. There's a place that I talk about that Rome, in a certain sense, their worship of victory, of Nike, was one of the centering structures of the Roman imaginary, that Nike was to be worshipped. But that parallel to that, there are also other stories that existed that were parallel to Rome in a certain way. So there was a story, and I'm actually looking for it now, that about Leto, the woman and the dragon, and we're not talking about Daenerys Targaryen, but Craig Koestler wrote a book called Revelation and the End of All Things, and he talks about this story in the Hellenistic world where there was a fierce dragon named Python and a woman named Leto, and was the mother of the god Apollo, and Leto becomes pregnant by Zeus, and the dragon pursues her in order to kill her and her child. The North Wind rescues the woman by bearing her to the island of Delos in the Aegean Sea, where she gives birth to Apollo and Artemis. So Apollo sets out in pursuit of the dragon, slaying the creature to revenge the mother. So that's a particular story that existed in that culture. And identification with that story served a kind of imperial understanding that a citizen of Rome could read that story and think of it as a reflection of their own experiences. The woman is the goddess Roma, would readily think of that, sort of notion. The killing of the dragon founds a new golden age. The emperor benefits from the identification. Nero put himself in the place of Apollo. Well, John is narrating a different reality. The woman and the reality that John narrates. And so if we think about the fact that that kind of pursuit story of the dragon, seeking to squash a thing in its nascence before it gets started, the church or Virgin Mary constitutes a threat to the dragon, and represents, the woman represents, in a certain way, such a threat that the dragon seeks the destruction of all that's connected to that, Christ and the followers. So Revelation takes a tale that might be familiar to those in the Greco-Roman world and subverts it to talk about the way in which who is it that's pursuing the church? Who is it pursuing the offspring of the woman? So the truth torments those who seek power over others. And in the story of the woman and the dragon, there's a challenged earthly power that's in that story in a certain sense, because who does the dragon align itself with? The principalities that later show up then in Revelation 13. So the woman who flees to the wilderness has many children. These children are all a part of God's story. But as the dragon takes his stand on the sand, what we realize is that evil doesn't stand on solid ground or solid footing. Evil stands on shifting sand. And then you have the next sort of image in Revelation 13 of the beast and the prophet. And, now it's interesting, that dispensationalism in its incorporation of the notion of the Antichrist puts the Antichrist back in the book of Daniel. And the Antichrist is nowhere in the book of Daniel.
Or the book of Revelation, really.
Or the book of Revelation. Yeah, and children, there are many Antichrists among you. But they create that image or that idea, which once again kind of structures our social imagination to think about what that figure is or what it represents. And that's where it really gets interesting then for the dispensationalist, and also, we haven't talked about this yet, the Christian Zionist, right. Who follow the dispensational interpretive grid. Now, I don't know if that's what you were looking for when you asked about the woman and the dragon, but it It's not disconnected from other stories that the culture knew and understood.
Right. And I think that's critical, is that there's a way that this story makes sense within its first century setting that is drawing on bits of cultural appropriation from its own cultural context, and it's using them to subvert them, right? That's not necessarily, some people get nervous about that kind of language, but I think that's what the early Christians are doing with their appropriations of these forms, is they're taking them and they're redeploying them for their own, for their own narrative that says, no, it's not the gods of Rome who are in charge. It's the God of Israel that's in charge. And the God who raised Jesus is the one who's in charge here. Okay. So, the idea that you would take, a well-known form and say something about God, like all well and good, and maybe that's actually an impulse that's not a bad impulse in the dispensational way of trying to read these stories, and say, actually, let's talk about what these things tell us about today. Maybe the stumbling block is them thinking that that's what they're intended to talk about is today, and kind of over realizing our own place in these old stories that people have been reading for a couple thousand years. But how we read these texts, there are some pitfalls beyond luring some men to drop out of college in the spring sophomore year. Talk about the Christian Zionists and how eschatology has had some real life impact in significant ways in the world.
Well, Christian Zionists, and not all Christian Zionists are dispensationalists, but many, if not the overwhelming majority of dispensationalists are Christian Zionists. And by that, I mean that they have accorded Israel to a certain role in end times prophecy or biblical prophecy. And when John Nelson Darby and C.I. Scofield, who took Darby's ideas and made what arguably is one of Oxford University Press's bestsellers, the Scofield Reference Bible, created this, they had a certain understanding of Israel in mind. Along comes Lord Balfour and Shaftesbury and others in Britain, who are also according sort of Israel a particular place in end times prophecy. And so what happens is that as world events unfold, if you've accorded Israel a certain sort of place, if you've said, okay, so at the end of the world, the third temple is going to be rebuilt on the site of where the temple stood. If the third temple is going to be rebuilt so that the sacrifices can be restored, like we're interpreting out of these texts, then Israel has to be able to do that. So in 1948, then, when the United Nations sort of creates Israel out of fiat, that's seen as a fundamental fulfillment of biblical prophecy. In 1967, when Israel takes over parts of Jerusalem, marches up to the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall, but stops short of Temple Mount for various reasons. Once again, Christians see fundamentalist, dispensational Christians see biblical prophecy being fulfilled. So here's the thing. If your idea of fulfillment of prophecy means that the temple has to be rebuilt, the third temple, and there's a space that occupies it. Let's just say Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock.
Just to take, a random example,
which I was standing in last week. Not the Dome of the Rock, but the Temple Mount precinct. Then you are okay with any attempt to eradicate the Muslim presence off of that space so that the temple can be rebuilt. And there are, in fact, instances of misguided Christians who have tried to be God's little helpers and make that happen. So, there are bullet holes in those facilities. There's burn marks in Al-Aqsa Mosque where the thing was set on fire, which now has meant that it's not as free to get in and out of that as it used to be. If you have a particular understanding of how Israel functions in end times prophecy, and that's what Christian Zionists have, then you are not inclined to be critical of Israel or Israel's political policies in any way, shape, form, or fashion. Unless there's a more left-wing political alliance that shows up, then you can say that it's all evil, which John Hagee, Pat Robertson, Tim LaHaye, and all of those guys, when Rabin was in office and was assassinated, they saw that as an actual act of God, that God was in fact involved because Rabin was standing in the way of Israel acquiring 100% of the land of Palestine. So you can see where the tensions then between the political order and the influence that Christians like John Hagee and Kufa, Christians United for Israel, they exert enormous influence on politicians in the United States to maintain a kind of whatever Israel does is right, and whatever land they take actually belongs to them by biblical warrant, which aligns itself fine with a lot of the different rabbinical groups and ultra-Orthodox groups in Israel who believe the same thing.
Yeah. It's a big mess. I mean, and this is actually one of those realms in which I think giving a Christianized rereading of Jewish texts could chase in Christians in a good way, right? To think about what does the New Testament actually claim for the covenant promises for God's people, and to just without. If you can do it without deprecating Jewish people, which I mean, even of course, as you point out in the book, all of this, let's give the land to Israel stuff. It's basically give them the land so that they can be slaughtered by God sooner.
That's the spooky part about it. If I'm a Jew, I'm very nervous about making allies with those people.
Right. Okay, so. One thing that you say in the book is we live narrated lives.
Yes.
I would love to hear you maybe now to sort of wrap up, to pull back from the weeds of the particular texts and some of the geopolitical things. And can you do a little reflection for us on the significance of the stories we tell for our lives and how to tell a better story so we end up with a life-giving narrative rather than death-dealing narratives, whether be it in our eschatology or anything else.
Yeah, that's a great one. I mean, you're the story theology guy. I'm just sort of fumbling along, but essentially the older I get, the more I've come to realize that stories shape who we are. And even the stories that we tell when we're sitting around the dinner table at Thanksgiving about Weird Uncle Charlie, or do you remember that time when? These things form our deepest identities. The stories that we embrace and that we internalize shape our understanding of the world, our understanding of God, our understanding of the relationship between those two. They shape our understanding of ourselves. And there is a certain sense in which if you accept a kind of narrated vision of God from biblical text, that God is the ultimate ruler and that God is going to punish, that the wrath of God is sort of central to your story, then there's certain parts about the Christian narrative, about suffering love, that are going to be really hard for you to wrap your head around. It's going to be really hard for you to enter into the kind of compassion, for instance, that lends itself to something other than a black and white Manichaean separation of the sheep and the goats at the end. And I allude to this. Ultimately, Jesus' eschatological vision is an ethical one. You know, at the end, Jesus says, you know, those who feed the hungry, those who take care of the vulnerable. I mean, so there's a certain way in which that Jesus narrates a certain understanding of how we are to be in the world that does not necessarily concern itself with jumping onto airplanes and flying around chasing the tribulation force, chasing the Antichrist, that there's something that we're supposed to be about.
You mean there's a better story than that? Being an action hero for Jesus?
Yeah, but that's the one that occupies the imagination of between 30 and 40 million Americans. I mean, over 40 million copies of those books have sold. The story that Jesus tells of the end, that at the end of time, when the sheep and the goats are separated, in a certain sense, and I've always wondered, I'm not a New Testament scholar, but I've always wondered about the idea that, in that text, it says that God gathers the nations. Mm-hmm. So are we talking about individuals here? Or are we talking about the corporate actions and behavior of communities of people? But anyway, that aside, how we understand the stories that we internalize impacts the way that we live. I actually think that I get so apophatic in my theology sometimes that I think that we can know nothing about God, period. But the stories that we tell about God have an understanding of the way that we are in the world. And the way that we are in the world, there are vastly different ways. And when you look at those different ways, I guess there is a part of me that says, so what are these ways that lead to redemption, healing, those aspects of what I understand a Christological centered life to be? And what are the ways that lead to the creation of enemies, the destruction of our enemies, the desire to protect self above all other things? And I think our stories lead us into those directions.
Yeah. I think that is critical. How we think about what the gospel actually is will deeply influence and to a great extent determine what we think a faithful Christian life looks like. And when the gospel is turned from the wrath of God so you don't go to hell, that creates a set of practices that the world does not very often look at and see God in, and that can end up destructive for people as they're trying to figure out how to be in a relationship with this God they can't trust, and for the church community and the cultures that we're in as well. I think that's why people who pay attention to the life of Jesus as the gospel, the theological traditions, end up with a more life-giving ethos about them, precisely because of the stories they tell.
Yeah, and I want to just make sure that the listeners to this, I'm not reducing the gospel to ethics. I don't mean to be doing that, but what I am arguing is the same way that Augustine argues that we are moving, and I don't like binaries, but we either make manifest the city of God or the reign of Babylon. And there's a way in which there are habits and practices and virtues and public goods in the city of God that are antithetical to Babylon's reign. And that's exactly what we find in Revelation. And I think that's another one of the great things about apocalyptic literature is it does ask the question, toward what end are we moving?
All right. Well, I think that might be a great place to wrap up and leave people with this sort of imperative. Go write children's VBS theme songs about don't be a Babylon, be a Jerusalem. And, you can talk about, don't be a barterer of bodies, something like this. And souls are not for sale. I think we got something that can work here. All right, friends, this is Jeffrey Pugh. His book is The Homebrewed Christianity Guide to the End Times, Theology After You've Been Left Behind. You can grab that at Amazon or wherever fine books are sold. Jeffrey, thank you for joining us on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Daniel.
All right. Peace, everybody.